All right, good. So welcome to today's webinar. So today's webinar, we're going to talk about GPU performance in Azure. Okay, so with us, we've got Michelle Roth and James Haywood. So Michelle, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, sure. Thank you very much. So my name is Michel Roth. I work at Microsoft as a global black belt, which is Microsoft language for saying that I specialize in certain workloads. And for me, that's Azure Virtual Desktop and high performance computing, which for Microsoft also includes GPU-based workloads. That's me.
We've also got James Haywood with us. So James, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, good afternoon. James Haywood. I work as an infrastructure architect for Dyson and focusing quite a lot on the Azure side, including AVD, and obviously using Nerdio, which is why I'm here.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, so my name is Neil McLaughlin. I'm the UK field CTO for Nerdio. So I'm here to show you the sort of the Nerdio capabilities and how we can help deliver GPU workloads with Azure Virtual Desktop. Okay, so let me just get onto the next slide. Okay, so this is what we're going to cover today. Michelle's going to first of all begin and is going to go over sort of the requirements of engineering anywhere, how AVD meets those requirements, and then a few slides on performance and cost of running your sort of GPU workloads within Azure Virtual Desktop. And then I'm going to hand over. I'm going to go over, and then we're going to go over basically some Nerdio capabilities, and I'm going to go through 7 features of how Nerdio can help deliver those kind of engineering workloads to enable sort of cost saving, image management, that kind of thing. And then James is going to sort of give a customer story of how within Dyson they've managed to sort of leverage Azure Virtual Desktop, GPUs and Nerdios to deliver a really good solution. And then at the end we're going to do Q&A. So if you've got any questions, please keep them towards the end, and because we've got a lot of content to go through, it's going to be very, very demo heavy. So we're not just going to show you slides, we're actually going to show you kind of real world usage. We've got a GPU workload up and running, which we're going to go through. We're going to show you some sort of CAD CAM stuff. So I'm going to hand over to Michelle now. He's then going to sort of give us the overview of all the Microsoft capabilities that we have for GPU workloads within Azure Virtual Desktop.
Sounds good. Thank you, Neil. Let me go ahead and share my screen with the folks here. Bear with me. We'll share. Yep, there we go. So you should see the slide, right, Neil?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you everybody for joining, and we're very grateful to see so many people showing the interest. So the discussion that we'll have today, or at least what we'll be talking about, the angle or really the use case is something that we see very often in the engineering industry or manufacturing. But I think whatever we discuss today really applies to if you're using GPU-based workloads, then this will also apply to you. So you could also be in education or energy or oil and gas. It doesn't really matter. I just want to say that because there's a lot of engineering speak that we have here, but it applies across all industries, the technology that we're sharing here. So when we speak about these engineering customers, really, if you had to summarize what they want to achieve, is to be able to engineer from anywhere with anyone. And we'll talk about what exactly this means, what requirements they have, and how AVD can help meet those requirements. Another thing I wanted to point out is that when we're speaking about engineering, especially in the case of the broader sense, is that what we're talking about here is really, I would say, the front end of the whole engineering workflow. So it's the rendering, it's the designing, and there's many other aspects, right? All the way down to simulation, analysis, AI is a very important part. All of which Microsoft has solutions for, and that in my department I work with. But just to set the stage, what we're talking about here is the visualization, pre or post processing, but it's really the visualization part that we're focusing on here. So if we then look at what we've learned from our customers. What are the requirements that they have? What's important for them when they're talking about using their engineering workloads on Azure. The first thing, like for many people, is security. So whatever they're doing needs to be secure, especially given the fact that people that do these designs have they work with very high value IP. So it's something that's super important. The other thing is that they have this desire to be able to work from anywhere, and that almost automatically implies that they want to have less device dependency, so you can work from any device. Also, with these workloads, it's even more important than in normal workloads to have collaboration. So you'll recognize that you'll have people working on the same project. And it's important that they are able to efficiently work together on the same project, so the same drawing, for example, without compromising on performance. And the reason why sometimes it's a challenge to work together on these big projects is because literally they are big projects, meaning there's very, very large data sets that you have to work with. And whatever you choose to do needs to support that effort. And then, of course, performance, I guess also in line with these large data sets, but just not the data set alone, also visual performance obviously needs to be good to work. And then finally, there's the aspect of cost, right? And not just the cost of running the solution, but also having control, centralized control, effective control over licensing, because these software that you may use are not the cheapest, right? So those are the things at a high level that are important. And then when we look at, how is AVD able to help customers with that? First, security is that when you start using Azure Virtual Desktop for your remote engineering workloads, the actual work happens in the place that you fully control, right? So your IP, if you don't want to, it will never leave Azure. Compare that to what some people do today or have to do, shipping a laptop maybe to a far-off country to help a remote engineer get up and running. It's very difficult to keep that same level of control over the super important IP that you have in that design. And with AVD, that's much easier. Also, there's built-in protection mechanisms to prevent data leakage. So you have screen capture protection, and there's even watermarking as of recent. Maybe Neil will have a chance to show that. But the point is that AVD itself has a lot of built-in security capabilities. Multi-factor authentication, for example, is also very easy to add. Conditional access, but also the bigger Azure ecosystem will be able to help you a lot there. Also, as you probably know, since AVD will offer a virtual desktop or remote app to a user, all you need is an AVD client and a network connection. And since we have AVD clients for almost every platform, and the bandwidth requirements and the latency requirements are getting less and less, you'll get to a place where really you can work from anywhere with any device. So that's something that AVD offers to help our customers achieve their goals. And from a collaboration perspective, and I think we won't be able to go into architecture details, but when you have your AVD workloads in Azure, and when your data is close to you as well, it's very efficient to work together on different projects without compromising on security or performance. And finally, which is also related to the previous subject of collaboration, is that typically we know that these engineering workloads have very large data sets. So Azure gives you great possibilities to limit the effect, the negative effect that you have when you have to move these workloads around, or more specifically, when you have to move these data sets around. So you can either choose to bring the virtual desktop close to the user, because AVD is almost in every Azure region, or you can bring the data closer, or perhaps even better, if you have the opportunity, you can do both, where you can really set effectively new speed records for people working with these engineering workloads. So that covers the aspect of security, working from anywhere, working together on these big data sets. And it leaves then the two other data points, which I'll zoom into a little bit more. It's cost and performance. So when we look into performance, when we speak about performance, the first thing that's important, obviously, is that you need to have a GPU available to the user. And the reason why I'm showing you this slide is that, and this is a bit of a theme, but a while back, let's say, a few years, 2 to 4 years ago, 2 to 5 years ago, there weren't that many options, at least not as many as we have today. So what's important to take away from this slide is that if you have users that have really high requirements, if they require a dedicated GPU, then we have those. We've had those for a while. There's new versions of them coming out, but for example, the NVV3 is available for us. The NCS T4 is also available. And that's a great solution for customers that have high demands, or individual users that have high demands. But the more recent, as of the last few years, advancements in Azure have allowed us to also offer VMs with a fractional GPU. So under the covers, the hardware is the same, right? So it's either an AMD MI25 or an A10 from NVIDIA, but we offer them fractionally, meaning that you can, for example, have, in the case of the NVV5, you can have 1/6 of an A10. So the point being, you don't have to pick a VM with a complete GPU, because if you require less, it's going to be very expensive, right? So this allows you to mix and match workloads for the right type of user, so that you don't overspend. And we'll talk about the costs in a little bit as well. I think the key takeaway is that we have a broader selection of GPU-based SKUs, and they're growing. I can't speak about it here, but keep an eye on the Azure roadmap, and you'll find that there's other very interesting SKUs becoming available as well. And it's actually a theme that will keep on going, right? So the NVV4, I forget when it exactly was, but let's say it's a few years ago. The NVV5 is pretty recent, and you could bet that there's also going to be an NVV6, all within the space of 2 or 3 years. And if you compare that to PC or laptop, it's probably unlikely that you'll refresh your hardware in that same amount of time, meaning that you'll be behind, right? And in Azure, you have this flexibility of almost instantly migrating to a newer version of a piece of hardware. So that's the GPU part covered, if you like, from a SKU perspective. Then, of course, the other part, very importantly, in the case of AVD, is the display protocol, right? The remote display protocol. I forgot to say this in the intro, but I've been working in the RDS space for a while, 20 years or more, sometimes longer than I expect. And this gentleman with the funny GIF is very recognizable, or I should say was very recognizable, because for the longest time, RDP really wasn't, and I say it politely, not very good when it came to challenging workloads. So either very bad network conditions or highly intense graphics, or, God forbid, a combination of the both. But if you haven't been really, keeping up, then it's easy to still think that RDP isn't very good. But if we look at all the changes that have been added to RDP, you can see that over the last years, there's been a tremendous speed up of benefits or capabilities added to RDP. And my goal here is not to go over every single bullet, but the key takeaway is that RDP has improved so much, right, that it serves a lot of use cases, right? I'm not going to stand here and tell you that it will work for every single deployment type that you will have, but it's so much more capable than most people think, that it's definitely worth calling out. So I guess you could say that if you look at these different possibilities that we have, for example, Many customers don't know that the RDP is capable of up to 60 frames per second if you need it, and that you also have the possibility to do lossless compression, or true image quality, where you don't have any loss of quality in the images that you have. So overall, that's the key takeaway here. RDP is much more capable than you think. And you should use it accordingly, right? There's some things you need to know. We'll also discuss in this presentation. But the protocol is capable of delivering the performance that you need in most cases. So that covers the performance aspect. Then the final part I'll speak about before we'll hand over to the really exciting stuff from Neil and James is the business side of things. Because obviously, you could do anything you like, but if it's a bad business case, then it's going to be hard to sell internally. So I think one important thing to think about is that, especially when you're talking about very, expensive workloads, so GPU-based workloads, it's very important to be able to align to your business, meaning that it's much more efficient to pay for what you use than it is to try and guesstimate upfront how much you need, and then in a relatively short write-off period, because this hardware is ever changing, try and guess it again. So especially combined with Nerdio, right? You can really zoom in and get or only pay for what you use, right? And then you can match your business requirements. So if you have a project that requires external developers from, for example, India, it's very easy to bring those people in because of all the other capabilities I discussed earlier. But also from a pricing perspective, if that's a temporary thing, then you pay only for that period versus shipping out laptops and then writing them off or trying to get them back or anything in between. So I think that's the first important thing that I wanted to say. The second is that, as you probably know, one of the unique benefits of AVD is that when you use AVD, you get the usage right to Windows 10 or Windows 11 multi-session. And Windows 10 and Windows 11 multi-session, also for other workloads, are a super popular choice. Because it combines the benefits of Windows Server, which is the density of multi-session, with the benefits of normal Windows 10, single-user Windows 10, which I would explain as for other workloads. The thing is, what's important is that it's the same look and feel, right? So Windows 10 in AVD is exactly the same as Windows 10 on your PC or laptop. The thing that makes it extra interesting for GPU-based workloads is that what we found, and maybe you'll have questions or comments about it, but what we found is that application compatibility is even more key in GPU-based workloads than it is in general workloads. And the vendors that in the end have to create this support statement, they really only test against, or they primarily test, and they primarily develop for a desktop operating system, so Windows 10 or Windows 11. So when you have Windows 10 or 11 multi-session, the step of it being supported or the chances of it working is much higher than if you have to do multi-session on a server operating system. So that's something to keep in mind. And then if we quickly go over an example case, and I'll say it in capital letters. It's an example case, but it's not really about the exact euro amount in this case. It's more about the mindset. And so the example here is that we have an engineering workload that in this case requires a VM that has 8 vCPUs and 28 gigs of RAM. And all these other system requirements. If we look at the easiest way to do this is to give everybody a personal desktop, right? So the fine print is that it's 500 users, so it means 500 VMs. Great, that works for most people. What we try to explain our customers that if you want to make the most of AVD, you have to optimize where you can. So one simple optimization is to use pooled desktops, right? So now you still have single session, but you have them pooled. So you're paying for the concurrent amount of users. So in this example, it's 75% concurrency. So out of the 500, there's 75% working concurrently. So you'll need less VMs, less disks, and so forth. And also keep in mind that if you think about concurrency, you should also think about the bigger picture. So imagine if you look at it over 3 years or over 1 year, maybe you have a project, right, at some point where you have to bring in external people, they do some work for you, then they leave. That impacts your yearly concurrency, right? Some people forget, but that's also important. But of course, the place where you want to get to is by using multi-session. So in this example, it's a very simple example, and we could speak about it for 10 hours. But in this case, we're picking a VM. It's the NV32. So out of this queue, it's the largest one, and that's 4 times as large as the choice that's highlighted, the NVVA, so 4 times as large. But since not everybody will be doing the same thing at the same time, it's very likely that instead of getting 4 times more users than 1, so 4, you can actually get 5 people on a machine, right? And even in this small example of 500 users, getting 1 user more on it will save you 45%. So the big disclaimer here is that your mileage may vary wildly. So don't go away with these numbers and say, okay, this is what we have to pay for a GPU-based workload, because it varies wildly. But the takeaway is that here you have possibilities that you don't have in other places. Excuse me. So that's a great thing to keep in mind and to think about. And then my final slide before I'll hand over to Neil is that, like I said, your mileage may vary, and especially in these use cases, I probably don't have to tell you this, but the key thing is that you really need to know your applications, right? Because it's very application specific. If they support multi-session, if there's something special that you have to do, how many users you get on a machine, and so forth. So although Microsoft does not have that support statement, right, because it's the vendor of, for example, NGIS that has to do it, but we do have a page. It's linked here. We call it affectionately the cookbook, where we've done some work to show you how you can use these applications on Azure, what you need to look out for, what performance is like, and associated things. And then the final thing, this is a tiny link I have. I'm sure you've seen this, but there are some things that you need to do to AVD to make sure that you get the optimal performance out of it, which is especially important if you're using a GPU. And I think Neil has some great things to say about that. So at this point, I'll gladly hand it over to Neil.
Okay, great. Thanks, Michelle. Just one thing, we've got a question from Brad Smith. If you could put your questions in the chat window, and we'll try to get the questions towards the end. Obviously, we've got a lot of content to cover, so we just want to make sure that we cover as much content as we can, and then we'll do the questions towards the end. Okay. All right, so what I'm going to show you is actually obviously all the stuff which Michelle's just talked about. Okay, so we've got a quick demo basically showing the capabilities that we just spoke. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so you should be seeing my screen now. So what we've got here is we've got a Windows 10 multi-session host. Okay, so we can see the connection information. So from there we've got UDP. Okay, so as you may not know, UDP is really great for workloads like this because it greatly enhances the user experience, because we don't have to go through the gateway connection. We've got a direct UDP connection from my client to the session host. Okay, so we can see that here. So we wanted to show this demo because this stuff is like kind of real. We're not just marketing people. This stuff actually does work. So as you can see here, we've got UDP. We've got a round trip time of 10 milliseconds because I've got my VM within UK South. And we've got my available bandwidth, which is like greater than 301 megabytes a second. Okay, and as Michelle mentioned, we can go up to like 60 frames a second if we want to. So here we've got a GPU as well. So this is a GPU VM, which is Radeon, which I've got running inside the VM. So what we can see is now this may look choppy to you because it's obviously on the Teams call, but shortly I'll put the link in the chat window, which will show you a YouTube video of the actual real experience. But I'm just going to close this down. And then what we have to see, so we can look, if we look at the GPU usage, what we're actually doing here is we're actually using the GPU on the VM. Okay, so we can go stuff down here now. I'm not a Calican person, so I've been getting used to how to use all these tools, but we can still pan around. Now, to me, this looks completely and utterly clear. Okay, but the thing to remember here as well is if we look at the users, so this is actually a multi-session host. Okay, so what we've got here is we've got AutoCAD Revit installed on a multi-session host, and we've got a single installation which is providing the usage to two separate users. Okay, so this is myself, and then I've got another user, CAD user 1. Okay, so what I'll do there, just to show I'm not lying, is we'll go over to that. So this is my other user, which is sitting in a remote desktop web client, and then I can do the same thing on here as well. Okay, I can just go in here, and again, this is going to be using and leveraging that GPU capability up to like 60 frames a second. Okay, now obviously the bigger the spec the VM, the more users you can fit on that. Okay, so this is like a NVA, I think. So we can fit probably 3 or 4 users comfortably on there while it's doing that GPU usage. Okay. All right, so that's it for the demo. Now, what I'm actually going to then show you is the actual Nerdio capability and what we've done around that. So let me just go over to my slide deck and let me go from here. Okay, so from slide. Okay, so 1 second. What is Nerdio? So Nerdio is essentially a platform which sits on top of Azure Virtual Desktop. Okay, so we extend the Azure Virtual Desktop capability, and we do that in a number of different ways, which I'll explain to you today. But mostly it's to accelerate deployments. Okay, so we make Azure Virtual Desktop accessible to everyone. Anyone who's tried to deploy Azure Virtual Desktop without any Azure Virtual Desktop experience, quickly it turns out that it is actually quite difficult when you scale. Okay, so if you're not an expert on sort of scripting and automation, it can be quite difficult to manage. And we can also minimize the cost of that solution as well. Okay, so we have auto scaling, and this becomes really key when we're working with GPU VMs, as we'll get through when we go into the presentation, when we look at the auto scaling capabilities and powering all those VMs off when we need to, and reducing complexity as well. Okay, so again, we want to make things as simple as we can do. One common thing which we come across all the time at Nerdio is I've deployed my environment. How do I manage it? Okay, so if we've got like a level 1, level 2 help desk person, how do you get them to manage? Because they don't know anything about Azure Virtual Desktop. To them, it's new. They've never logged into the Azure portal before. They've never seen the Azure portal. Now, ask them to go and do an image update, and they'll look at you with like a blank face. You're like, I don't know how to do that. So we make that very, very easy to do within Nerdio. And we fully support Azure Virtual Desktop, but also Windows 365. And also Azure.HCI as well. Okay, so we're not just stuck to Azure Virtual Desktop. So what capabilities do we actually do? Okay, so these are the kind of main pillars that we come across. The first 2, I would say, are what I come across most often day to day when I'm speaking to customers, and cost. Okay, obviously, we're not going to deploy it if it's not cost effective, right? Especially in today's current climate. So cost optimization is something which we're hearing about more and more and more as kind of people are more aware of their budget and how much they're spending. And we can decrease the cost of running Azure Virtual Desktop by up to 85%. But more realistically in scenario, normal figures that I see normally around between 60 and 70% mark using the dynamic auto scaling, which I'll go through shortly. Image management. So again, every single call I go into customer with, tell me what problems you're having. It's either cost or it's image management. They're the 2 major things. And we've basically automated the best practice around image management that you can get around Azure Virtual Desktop. If you're not aware, image management can get very tricky within Azure Virtual Desktop because your image has to be generalized. Okay, so there's a lot of snapshotting, sys prepping, and if you've got like 5-10 different images, it can be very, very time consuming and complicated process. We've basically automated that whole process for you. We do application management, so we can do FSR app masking, we can do scripted actions, we can do MSX app attach, availability and resilience, so we can do active host DR, and we fully integrate with REST APIs, we can do scripted action deployment. So there's a lot of extending capabilities that you don't get natively within AVD, and that Nerdio just gives you to make that whole management experience a lot easier and a lot cheaper as well. Okay, so what is Nerdio? What does it actually consist of? So it's actually a number of native Azure components, which get deployed into your own subscription. Okay, so it's what we call an Azure web app, and it consists of like an app service, a keyboard database, a SQL database, and all those components together make up the Nerdio app. Now, the good thing is it's deployed inside your own subscription. Okay, and that means that any security policies, you can apply your own security policies to it. Obviously, any data that you held stays within inside your own subscription as well. So it makes it very easy to deploy. And it's also deployed from the Azure Marketplace as well. And it takes around 30 minutes to deploy. You get a 30-day free trial. So very, very easy to deploy. And it's also billed from the Azure Marketplace as well, right? So it just sits there as a line item on your Azure bill. So in theory, you should see your Azure bill go down. Because we've got Nerdio in there, we're basically switching off those compute resources when we don't need them. Now, we've been working very closely with Microsoft since the beginning, or even before AVD even existed. I think it is Project Dyson, as it was called previously, when it was Windows Virtual Desktop as well. Obviously, then it became Azure Virtual Desktop. So we've been there since day one, right? We have weekly calls with the Microsoft engineering team. We're very close to Scott Manchester. Obviously, we work with Michelle Roth a lot. So kind of we know AVD inside and out. It's all we've done since it existed, essentially. We've got over 2 million users under management of Nerdio, and we've got over 5,000 deployments that we've done. Personally, I do about 5 deployments a week with customers, sometimes more, and they're more generally in the more complicated sort of enterprise environments. But existing other customers, we do continue to onboard about 200 to 300 new customers every month. So Azure Virtual Desktop is not slowing down. It's continuing to grow and grow and grow, and it's really exciting to see. The features just continuing to get better and better and better. I mean, just this week we've had the release of like multimedia redirection, which is like a phenomenal feature which can really help with the Azure host density. We've had RDP short path recently as well. So the experience of running AVD is continuing to get better. So me personally, I consistently get excited about it, and I can't wait to see what happens in the future. Okay, so what are the typical AVD costs, right? So the cost is the critical thing when we talk about AVD, because that's the reason why most people are moving to Azure Virtual Desktop. Okay, normally they're moving because they want to move away from another vendor, or B, they want to move away from RDS, or they want to move all their workload into the cloud. Okay, they're the 3 main reasons why people move to AVD, and the cost factor is absolutely critical, because if it's too expensive, they're not going to use it. Okay, so what we do at Nerdio is what you see on the screen here. Okay, so we do cost reduction, right? So compute, that's by far the biggest cost that you can incur when you're running an AVD workload. And when you're running a GPU workload, that intensifies, okay, because you've got all your GPU VM is a lot more expensive than a normal VM. Okay, so we really need to keep control. The last thing that you want is a load of GPU VMs running in your data center 24/7, because you're going to get a huge bill, and your sort of a chief financial officer is going to say, right, get rid of AVD, it's too expensive. Okay, so we need to make sure that we keep that cost under control, and I'll show you how we do that using our sort of Azure Virtual Desktop auto scaling, which is extremely dynamic. Okay, so it can really get those squeeze those extra cost savings out of the environment. So the other thing we do around is the OS disk. So we swap the disk when the VM's not running, so that can save a bit of cost as well. Your FSLogix storage, that can be up to 9% of your cost. Some environments have seen it more, especially if they never clear it down. And networking, obviously, there's not much we can do about that. But what a lot of people, I mean, Michelle touched on before, right? The RDP protocol itself has evolved massively over the past couple of years. I think I saw a blog post once which someone mentioned that the bandwidth consumed or used by the RDP protocol within each Windows release goes down by like 50% or something, because they're trying to consistently optimize it. So that's continuing involvement in the RDP protocol, and I'm sure it continues to get better as well. Okay. All right. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is just 7 ways in which we can really sort of help with engineering workloads on Azure Virtual Desktop. So again, it's going to be very demo heavy. We're going to go through the Nerdio console. We're going to have a look and see how we delivered that desktop that you saw today. Okay. So we're going to talk about auto scaling for multi-session and personal host pools. We're going to talk about automatic GPU driver installation. Okay, so this enables when you deploy a VM, you don't have to worry about configuring the settings and also configuring the GPU, because Nerdio is going to do all that for you. We're going to ensure that your workload is going to be available by using Azure Capacity Extender. We're going to give you self-service capability. That's going to give you the capability for a personal desktop user to resize their VM. Okay, if they want to reimage their VM, they can do. If they want to start their VM, they can do. If they want to stop their VM, they can do. Okay, so we'll go for that when we go through the console, and definitely ease of management. Okay, so if you've not like an AVD guru, then you may find it very difficult. So we'll show you how you manage that via Nerdio as well, and of course, image management. That's something which is really big for us. Okay, so onto the demo. So this is the last of the slides. As I mentioned, this webinar is going to be very, very demo heavy. So I want to give you guys the best experience that we can do. So what I'm just going to do actually, so hopefully we'll see that towards the end of the webinar, but you can see my screen. So I'm just going to we're going to log off this client, and then hopefully, if Nerdio is doing its job properly towards the webinar, we'll see these desktops actually shut down. So I'm just going to log off this session. So this is the remote desktop web client session that I'm just logging off. So that's going to log me off. Okay, so I'm just going to close this one down, and then we're going to do the same thing with the remote desktop as well. So this is my multi-session. So as you see, my user's now logged off from that, and I can still go in there. We can still use a GPU. We can still look at performance. So we're still getting good performance from that. Okay. So obviously we don't want this GPU to be running 24/7. Okay, we want to be logging it off. So what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to log off. Okay, so we're just going to log this off. Okay, so this is me signing out. Now, if you need to reconnect to it, I could just use the remote desktop client to connect to it from there. Okay, all right. So now we're going to head over into the Nerdio console. Okay, so if I go into just get this over to here. Yeah, okay, all right, so this is the Nerdio console, okay? Actually, one thing which I didn't show you is I've actually got this thing called a 3D mouse that I'm using with that as well. So when I was doing the fligging around, I was actually using that. So I've actually got this thing here, and this was actually connected to the RDP session using the remote effects protocol as well, okay? So I could actually use this 3D mouse, which is quite a popular option for engineering workloads within inside the AVD session. So I thought that was like really cool. Okay. All right, so this is the Nerdio console, and as you can see, it's deployed inside the web app. So let me just get rid of these windows. I don't want to. Okay, so what I'm going to show you now is how we basically manage Azure Virtual Desktop using Nerdio. Okay, so we have our desktop images. So from here, I can create images, I can update images. Okay, so I can install software onto images. So I can just do like power off a setters image, and that's going to do the sysprep. We can distribute to the Azure Compute Gallery. There's lots of stuff that we can do even here, but we can also automate this and we can schedule it as well. So if we want to do automated image management, we can absolutely do that. Okay, so let's first look at the auto scaling. So if I go into my Nerdio workspace, so this is the workload we were just looking at. So what I've got here is I've got a multi-user desktop pool. Okay, we're running the NV8AS v4. Okay, that's the GPU VM that we're running. So what we can do, we can go into auto scale. We can go to your configure, and then we can just basically select some trigger points that we want to do. So we can select the image. So we've got a custom image. We can select that here. We can select the VM size, the running and stopped. So Nerdio is actually going to flick that disk over to a standard HDD rather than premium SSD. So you see over here, we're getting some cost savings from that. And we can see the maximum cost from the compute as well. So if I was using this VM 24/7 on pay-as-you-go, I'm going to be paying like £343 a month. That's for one single VM. So you can imagine if you've got 10 of those VMs, that's going to be like nearly £3,500. But what I can do here is I can select my base host full capacity. So this is the amount of VMs which I'm running with inside the workload. And then I can select my scaling logic, right? So if I wanted just to create like an extra 5 VMs, I can just click 5, click save and close, and then Nerdio is going to create those hosts for me. Okay, because what we can do via Nerdio is dynamic auto scaling. It's responsible for creation and deletion of those hosts. Okay, I can select 50, 500, whatever we want. And then I select the auto scale trigger based as user driven. Okay, and I select when all users log off scaling host after 10 minutes. So you just see me log off that session. That means after 10 minutes, that host is going to be powered off. Okay, so we're not paying for it. All right, so that's where the extreme cost savings really come in. And so I'll show you the cost savings that I've got in a minute. I've limited the sessions to 5 users per host, and then we can set the scale and restrictions. We can do pre-staging. So if you want that workload to be available at 9 o'clock in the morning, I can just select a custom time for that. And then if someone doesn't log on within like 2 hours, it's a bank holiday or something like that, then it's going to be switching off. Okay, so again, we're getting extreme cost savings from that as well. And we can see those cost savings as well. So as you see through this workload here, my cost savings are 93%, right? Because I've created this VM. I've just been going on and off to do my testing. So I've saved myself like £318 rather than having that VM sat there on page you go running 24/7 essentially. And it's going to tell me what my average cost is for that. So using it as I've done, that VM is going to cost me like £23 a month, which is not bad, right? But more importantly, what we can do, we can also look at the auto scaling history. So I can go into here, and then what I can do is I can actually look at the history of that host pool. So I can go to this month, and it's going to show me what's happening with that. So I can say this month, and it's going to show me how much I'm savings, when it's powered on, when it's powered off, the sessions, and the cost savings from that as well. So really, really cool. And some of the other things which we talked about before around what we can do with Nerdio is we can actually set some settings to really even more drive the user experience. So we talked about the self-service capability. So what we can do here as well is if I go onto a personal host pool, what I can do, I can go to the user self-service and I can actually resize that VM as an end user. Okay, so here I've got some like NV4 VMs, NV8, NV16, NV32, NV48, and then we can even resize the disk as well. So it gives your end users more control, and enables you to go in and resize them for different projects that they're working on as well if they want to. And the bit where we saw before around the GPU stuff, so I literally just need to press the tick box and that's automatically going to deploy those GPU drivers for me, and then we can run the scripted actions. Okay, so this is the automation which we were talking about before. So from here I can install AutoCAD by Chocolatey. I can enable screen capture protection to sort of save people from taking stuff they shouldn't be doing, and then we can also enable the optimizations to increase our host density around that host pool as well. And also, this is the Azure Capacity Extender I was telling you about. So what we can do there is, if for example, an NV8 AS is not available within that region, what I can just do, I can select alternative VMs, okay? And it's going to tell me the cost of those of them. So if I'm going to go down there to the region, it's going to tell me, oh, I don't have enough quota, for example, okay? But I can go and just see which ones I have available. So if I go down to pick all the NV8s, we'll see the different costs for all those VMs as well. So it just guarantees that kind of host availability for you as well. So makes it really, really easy to use Azure Virtual Desktop. Okay. One other thing I just want to show you is the image management capability that we have within Nerdio. So as I mentioned, ease of use is something that we're really, really strong on. It's like, obviously, we can do everything. We don't have to go into the Azure portal to manage Azure Virtual Desktop. We can do it all within a single console. So, for example, if I wanted to update an image, I just have to power it on, install my software using our scripted actions, for example, and then just power it off. You don't have to do snapshotting. You don't have to do sys prepping because Nerdio does that all for you. And then, for example, if I wanted to just update that host pool that we just done, I just need to go to the host pool, go to host, go to resize my image, pick either one from the marketplace or a custom image, then click run now. Then that's it. That's all I have to do. But what is really good as well, you can just repeat that. So I can set that to repeat once a month, for example, and then every month that image is just going to be re-imaged with the very latest version from the marketplace or any custom image that you've automatically updated via Nerdio as well. Okay. All right, so that's all I've got to show you today. I hope you found that useful. So now I'm going to hand over to James, who's going to tell you a bit about his experience of using Nerdio, also as a virtual desktop using GPU VMs at Dyson. So James, do you want to share your screen? Oh, yep, yeah.
There we go. Hello.
Okay, good.
Yeah, so obviously we've got quite a wide range of audience. We've spoken before about AVD and Nerdio. And really, just to put a bit of context in for the audience, is our real driving force with GPU is our VCAD environment. So we hit physical capacity in one of our physical DCs in region. We couldn't get hold of any of the hardware as we're talking. It was like last year, obviously with the supply chain issue, actually trying to get hold of hardware was difficult. Never mind getting it purchased, shipped, racked, stacked, purchase the licenses, everything up and running. So we were already using AVD for a couple of other solutions. So we decided, well, is AVD going to be good enough to run some of our more high performance workloads with GPUs? So essentially we tried it out. So we looked at some of the heavy GPUs and immediately ran into a couple of the points Michelle raised, which is things like it may be running in Azure, it may be virtual, it may be brand new, but you've still got to behave the way the applications are expecting you to behave. Some apps, you've got to turn off that hyper threading. So that was something we hadn't done before previously within Azure, so we had to go to MS. It turns out quite straightforward, but it's something you've got to think about. You've got to make sure the specific SKUs you're running supported by our application. So one of our primary apps we run, it turns out there's only 3 actual certified Azure SKUs. Okay, which so immediately limits the sort of variation you can use. But again, once we've done that, we got our software installed. Again, another stumbling block, we were using, you already mentioned it, Windows multi-session, using that, taking huge advantage of that across a couple of our other AVD deployments. But again, another one of our applications didn't support multi-session. So essentially shot that dead in the water. From speaking to the application provider, they are looking at that, but it's not quite there yet. So straight away, it went from the sort of huge amount of capability available to quite a narrow pool, but essentially, yeah, it was getting the software installed, getting the users, and starting to do the tweaks. Where we've talked about RDP short path, we've got that in place, making sure you've got a decent connection, making sure you've got fast storage, and yeah, and it turned out to be quite a success. It worked really well. One of our slight issues we have, and probably most people on the call are the same, we're not purely cloud, we're not purely Azure. So some of the source systems that our CAD systems are talking to are still on premise. So when we're pulling those data sets, we're pulling them over the WAN rather than over the LAN. So there is a slightly more delay because, the law of physics, your WAN connection is never going to be as good as a 10 gig connection across your LAN. However, the actual performance once it's inside the AVD environment was very, very good, and I've got some really, really good feedback, especially in the low latency areas. So that's another one, is your connection, to AVD from where you are is also going to be quite important. But it's so there's lots of different things to think about, but overall pretty successful. Really quite pleased. When Nerdio came in, which obviously Neil is, I know why you're here, is that, well, how do we manage it? GPU SKUs are not cheap. It's as simple as that. Okay, and generally our engineers don't work 24 hours a day. I'm sure our management would like them to work 24 hours a day, but it's not going to happen. So we looked at the sort of built-in AVD scaling rules, and they're there. And I know Michelle, we've talked about it in taking the feedback back. They're not great. They're a bit clunky, and unless you really know AVD and you can constantly keep an eye on them and tune them, they're not brilliant. So we had a good look at the Nerdio tool, took advantage of the sort of, is it 30 day, 60-day demo?
30-day free trial. Yeah. 30 days.
And basically it just made life so much easier. And I've just looked at our dashboard this morning, and across all our instances, we've saved up £6,000 so far this month. And it's only the 7th, 8th, maybe even 9th, so we're saving an awful lot of money already with those devices. So it's allowing us to, what's quite key, and you showed one of the tweaks there, which is in the mornings, make sure those VMs are available. All right, so that's what we're using Nerdio for. So when the engineers log on, they're not there. It doesn't take long to boot a VM and get people ready, but we don't want our internal customers, we don't want them getting an error message saying there's no resources, because for them, also unavailable. They have to raise a ticket. Blah, blah. It's not a good situation. So we try and make sure everything's available. Then during the day, again, as you showed in your demo, we start to power those machines off. But we also keep using the rules. We keep a bit of a buffer. So there's always spare machines running, but we're not running 100 VMs if we're only needing to run 30 or 40. And that's our key point at the moment, is just shutting down the VMs when they're not required. And that's saving us huge amounts. And also we're starting to use that as well. So when we're doing the patching and the updates, we can use that as they're shutting down and no longer in use. We can change the image to the next master or whatever it may be. So we're using that heavily. And generally it's working really well. And I think because we're using Nerdio, the GPU element really isn't as much as we thought. Once we got over the initial, using GPU and AVD, what do we need? Application support, latency, storage, that kind of stuff. Actually, once it's in AVD, we can just use it with Nerdio as we do all our other instances, the other remote apps, remote AVD. So we're really pleased with it. Really works really well. But you've got to remember on those CAD applications, you've still got these what can be fairly pernickety applications that require certain things, and they're a huge investment. So if they say they need hyper-threading turning off, you have to do that. If they say they only support certain cards, then you're going to have to make sure you get your right quota in Azure, which is what we had to do. Because it's not worth the investment. If you were buying a physical CAD workstation, you'd go through that specification process, by default, and you've still got to take that mindset into Azure. And the fact it's virtualized and abstracted away, you've still got to make sure you've got your right specs. But luckily, most of the software we've got is supported. We're just trying to, if we can push to multi-user, then I'll be a happy man. I can reduce the amount of VMs we need. But at the moment, Nerdio's picking up that slack for us, and it's going well.
If I may ask, James, so in the beginning you said that even if we wanted to get the hardware, we would have been able to because of various reasons. So help me understand, how does that impact your business? Because I don't know the insides of your business, but what's the impact of not doing it? Because that's also an option, right? Yeah.
The fact is, everyone knows Dyson, we're an engineering company. If our engineers can't access the services, then they're just not productive. It's as simple as that. And what we were running into in region is engineers not being able to work. And for a company that relies on engineering, it's just not acceptable that they can't do it, which is why coming up with the AVD requirement, and it was quite quick and quite dirty really at the beginning. It was, let's just try it. Let's get the software installed. Let's get some SKUs up. Let's just try it, because if it's gonna, even if it's not as good as on premise, because we've got latency or whatever it may be, it's got to be better than not doing anything. And actually, it turns out it's a really good solution, and it's worked well for us. But not doing anything was just not an option. We have to provide services to our internal customers. It's as simple as that.
Yeah. And did you, because it sounds like you're pretty far along, are there benefits you see now that you didn't expect when you went into the whole project?
But there are some, like I said, because we'd been using AVD previously, we knew a lot of the benefits, but we were quite surprised that some of the engineers were saying actually performance is better once we've got those large files loaded in. Actual performance of the VM, bearing in mind they're sat in an office, and working for a remote desktop in the cloud, the performance was actually better over that WAN connection than it was over the LAN, just because the GPU was there. They had low latency, and we're making sure we had the right things, like RDP short path was involved. We had the right drivers. So that was a bit of surprise that actually we could get some better performance. If we can get our back end maybe in the clouds, which are much closer to that AVD, and we can reduce the copy times of those large files, that's going to be another great step. But obviously that's a much wider sort of question with the business, because CAD is just that single workload.
Definitely, I think it's I get so excited about Azure Virtual Desktop because the way the technology is evolving and the stuff that you can do with it. I mean, when I started working with sort of DAS or VMs within Azure, I was like, this is probably about 5 years ago. And I was like, there's no way you'd do that because we spent so much time doing VDI, getting the workload closer to the user, right? To get that sort of round trip latency as small as we possibly can do. And then we seem to do the complete opposite. But to look at where we've got now down to stuff like RDP short path and improvements in the RDP protocol, you're right. We can have like a near LAN-like experience with VMs hosted within Azure. And I think that's an absolutely amazing thing. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how this, I mean, AVD is only like 3 years old. So it's a technology. So what's it going to be like in another 3 years? That's what makes me really excited. So definitely a exciting place to be.
Yeah, definitely.
And one parting questions, if I may, James. I think you explained some of it already, but for people on the call that want to do something similar that you did, are there any pointers or things that you key takeaways? I know you mentioned the latency, right? But maybe other things too.
Yeah, you need to work with application teams. The whole purpose of providing those engineering workstations is for the applications and the engineers to use them. So you've got to make sure those applications are supported and will work. Think about your latency and your bandwidth. Otherwise, it'll be a poor experience. Think about Nerdio if you're going to be deploying a number of workstations to cut the amount of work down. And they're the main points. And also you've got to think. Well, it's outside of the scope of this, but your wider Azure environment. We spent quite a lot of time deploying the Azure landing zones, so we already had authentication. We already had our WAN in place. We had firewalls. We had our guardrails. We already had policy. So we already had a lot of the underlying infrastructure in place. So dropping AVD engineering workstations was quite straightforward for us. But if you haven't got that, you need to really think about your Azure environment as well, because all those different pieces join together. AVD doesn't exist in its own sort of silo. But yeah, it's all doable. And one of the beauties of it, and if you want to sell it to your finance teams, okay, there's no ROI. And you can turn things off. And that's one of the beauties we've got. If you hit 6 months and you need to change, you can just turn it all off.
Yep.
Okay, you're not having to buy £15,000 workstations and run them for 3 years to get an ROI. And that's one of the extra benefits. Sorry, crunch the time.
So for me, the beauty is as well, you could run those workloads. I mean, obviously, Azure is a consumption-based service. You pay for what you use. So if you only want to use those workloads for like 2 hours a day, you only pay for it for 2 hours a day, right? You haven't, as you said, outlaid that $15,000 to pay for this massive GPU workstation, whereas you can only pay like £20-30 a month just to do that work that you need to do, and then you save yourself a ton of money. So it's a very, very exciting thing. So. Okay. All right. So I think we're at the end of our webinar today. We've overrun slightly. Which is always good. Good conversation. I appreciate we've got some questions in the chat window, but probably not going to get time to get to. So look, if you want to contact us, you can email myself. It's nmclaughlin@getnerdio.com. Or you can contact Michelle about anything sort of Microsoft related. And also Michelle's got his LinkedIn profile up, which you can see on the screen there as well. But I just want to thank you for attending today's webinar. Hope it's been useful, insightful, and maybe it's been so popular, we may do some follow-up ones of these as well. So it's been really good fun. So thank you again, and see you soon.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.